Please make sure that you're muted, but feel free to turn your camera on for this if you'd like.
It's such a pleasure and a challenge to kick off this series. We are talking about a very complex topic that poses an intellectual, existential, and moral commitment to scholars. The need to share our knowledge, to talk to each other, and to those joining us throughout this series. I would like to say that is probably symptomatic based on the issue at hand, or at least some aspects that I'd like to emphasize today. It is rather telling that the events surrounding October 7th and their impact on the Jewish world and in general globally have created a situation, October 7th and the ensuing war. And those of us who are here virtually know and have heard of the agreement for a ceasefire and the end of hostilities between Israel and Hamas after a very painful process for both parties. Many deaths, a great deal of pain. And if we could understand the repercussions in other countries, especially stemming from this conflict, we would be able to have a historical perspective of the issue of anti-Semitism. We know, and we have said, and we have written that anti-Semitism is persistent throughout history, but its nature its functions and manifestations have changed and change, they cut across history through a logic of continuity and change. It can be expressed in different manners. It can be diffuse or more evident. If it's latent, there are various social configurations that act as incentives to lay it bare. And what happened today, and I'm talking about the conflict and the manifestations and expressions, differential expressions of manifestation of anti-Semitism around the world can happen individually or collectively. We are faced with a juncture where the conflict has led to challenges to collective national and political Jewish life in the state of Israel, as well as the project, the idea of a national rebirth, which is Zionism. I believe that the singularity of anti-Semitism, its uniqueness, is directly related to its recurrence and historical permanence, as well as its changes and transformations. Racism has preceded this. Today, we see a major trend of putting anti-Semitism, or actually reducing it to simply a form of racism, to the racial basis for discrimination. The racial basis for discrimination of Jews was preceded by other cultural, religious foundations, and with sources and motives that are of social, economic, and political nature. Its genocidal impact in the Holocaust projects this as a determinant phenomenon of the human condition in modernity. And that is why today we see the questioning and challenging of the memory of the Holocaust as excessive or Eurocentric, or either the process of reverting and turning the victim into a victimizing, saying that the Jewish people are now perpetrating a new Holocaust, crosses the borders between prejudices and political positions. So, if I may add, what I will try to present to you today is how discourses and actions are the channels through which anti-Semitism flows in a way that is not always, that stakeholders are not always conscious of, but on which way sociological reflection is possible. As a social process, it acts as a mechanism that excludes the other symbolically, initially, with a negative imaginary that society has historically constructed. And that is why, in part, my interest in research has been to analyze the expressions of anti-Semitism and their discursive production. But this does not mean that we're always faced with the same phenomenon. At different times, we can recover old elements that we see that together with new expressions being acquired. I believe that we're faced with a universe of ideologies, theories, worldviews, conceptualizations that interact and guide behavior. And so we have, from what we call symbolic violence perpetrated through discourse, all the way to harassment, physical violence, and murder, or historically, the racialization of a people leading to its annihilation. Before I begin my presentation, and I have a slide deck that I have prepared for today, but before that, I'd like to mention that when analyzing anti-Semitism in Latin America, it's necessary to take into account that excessive emphasis has been placed on what is supposed to be the main feature of the region, implying certain risks. The risks of a simplistic identification of Latin America, reductionist, in fact, with as if it were simply a space for intolerance and anti-Jewish expressions. We must strike an analytical balance to enable us to look at this singularity, this uniqueness, and put it within the context of what we see around the world now. Let me now share with you a few slides. I'm going to share my screen. And let me start by saying that when we look at the region, what I just mentioned is it a permanent feature? I don't think so. I think it has been seen differently in different manifestations throughout history. And this is just an overview. I think that throughout the series, we will be looking at different junctures and aspects, because during the conquest and during the Inquisition, for example, it did play a central role in the projects, in the nation building projects in Latin America and the search for national integration. There were also expressions of rejection directly linked to the European, with a European and regional impact. The search for the construction of national profiles through ethnic functions by recognizing them or not. And also by bearing in mind certain types of race mixing. And based on a concept that we call multiple modernities, different ways of being modern, which are not necessarily in keeping with the Central European model. And also the failures of these attempts, which have led to having an author call Latin America a mausoleum of modernities, nationalisms and pre-nationalisms, and their different expressions is what I'm talking about, especially when the issue of immigration and the arrival of Jews to Latin America, to the various countries in the region, was faced with various types of rejection from negative imaginaries. I'm also talking about the time when fascism and liberalism came to a confrontation. I'm just giving you a brief overview. I'm assuming that throughout this series, we'll have a chance to delve deeper into this. And having Catholicism become a civic religion and the role of the Catholic Church also lead us to take a step further and think about the place for populisms and people, the people, and these projects, this new way of integration, form of integration, where Jews are not necessarily involved as part of the concept or encompassed in the concept of people. What happens at political times when there is a backsliding in democracy. And this takes me back to something that will probably cut across this series or all of these series about anti-Semitism throughout different regions. There is a regional issue at play and also a global issue at play. In Latin America, without a doubt, there are recurring crises. So let us move on. One of the main points I'd like to bring up is that when I talk about this historical imaginary, I am referring especially to the historical stereotypes of Jews concerning Jews, how they have evolved, and the overlapping of these prejudices. Because anti-Semitism is produced and reproduced in terms of discourse, but it may be subjective through images, myths, attitudes, and behaviors and actions. In this sense, I believe it has been important to go over how these fixed images are built, constructed as Unitarian, as negative images, as if they were geological layers. So that begs the question, how is hate and hate speech sociological organized? How do we see others? How do we view others? And how that's perceived and transmitted and conveyed? And I am going pretty fast, but I'd like to talk about the historical images that we have been, a genocidal people, world domination, a global conspiration, money lovers, a powerful, immoral, and selfish people, the uprooted, and also an outsider. And then there are other expressions such as the Zionist lobby with a different character, and that leads us to Israel and Zionism. I believe that there is a conceptual matrix, meaning a set of concepts that will lead us, and I'll talk about this later, about the issue of colonialism, the state of Israel as a global Jewish project, not as a project for the creation of a new society, a new nation, a new country, but rather as part of a colonial project pushed forward by large empires, leading all the way to apartheid, which is what we're seeing now in colonialism. And later, I will talk about how the borders, the frontiers between anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism, and criticism of Israel, which may be legitimate but also anti-Semitic, end up disappearing. Those borders end up disappearing. Let me move forward. So I'll talk about how this imaginary is constructed. If we look at Mexico, for example, and since I have focused on Mexico, we see how it's built. And there is a combination, I'd say, of political schools and trends during migration, and also the opening up of borders to refugees from the Nazi regime. So what I'm trying to show you here is how connections start to emerge, where we see that both the left and the right, and I'm talking about different governments now, let's say at times of a progressive government such as Cardenismo, we see immigration and refuge, exile actually, as expressions that built this in calling Jews tribal, selfish, and we see the intellectual right, we see them as pernicious foreigners, secularizing forces, agents for modernity, and we see groups that have an influence on government policies such as non-assimilable, etc. If we look at Argentina, we'll find something that I feel is fundamentally important and interesting to bring up, which is the emergence, and I'm talking about the 1950s and 60s mainly, about the emergence of the argument of double loyalty. They're servers of Israel, it is said, but also linked to the Eichmann trials, when he was captured in Argentina. The issue of Zionism as a problem emerges as justification for anti-Semitism. And in this construction of tropas, and if you'll allow me, I would like to stop sharing my screen and just look at you and bring up certain aspects that I believe are a leap forward to the current situation. The beginnings happened through a radical change in the perception and image of the Jew and Israel, two interconnected concepts. Israel is no longer seen as a country of refugees, of those who fought fascism, and has become a country that will be facing issues such as the occupation. I am referring to several facts and processes that have changed the atmosphere and public discourse. And I am, I do not, do not want to be overly superficial and make generalizations because of the lack of time. But we're talking about a process that developed throughout the decades, and there are several processes at hand. First of all, the Six-Day War, then the failure of the Russian arms, and the breaking of relations with Israel, and the new alliance with the Arab world, which has had a fundamentally important impact, especially when taken together with the outburst of anti-Semitism in the former Soviet Union, in Eastern Europe, Poland, the expulsion of Jews, East Germany, the staunch support for the Arab world. So a year later, in 1968, student movements and minority movements, university campuses in 1968, which also included some very worrisome expressions vis-a-vis a universalism that is what was sought by this new generation of young people. So gradually, we saw the breaking up of relations with Asian and African states after the war, have led to a global atmosphere that is expressed regionally and also domestically in a very worrisome manner. Little by little, the concept and the image of Jews as refugees historically in the state of Israel is now being superseded by what is being built as the victim of the time, which is effectively the Palestinian people, which consolidates even further, and that leads to the process of occupation that will lead to great fundamental criticism emerging. We will soon talk about, when I talk about student movements and minority movements, I'm also referring to very close links between Malcolm X and Arafat. And when the issue of violence and revolution are in the air, and this, without a doubt, is to the detriment of Israel's position. If I may add, there's an additional step, which is the emergence in the intellectual world of a new left, which was a result of the disillusionment after the Vietnam War, also with the Soviet Union and Marxism. And this new left is anti-establishment and radical, and will lead to a negative approach to Zionism. It identifies Israel as imperialistic and racist, and anti-Zionist criticism also hit the victims of this criticism, which is Jewish culture. And this process, as I said, did not happen in a vacuum. It evolved against the backdrop of changing conditions in Israel. I am going back to my presentation now. So here we are. I've said this already, so let me move forward. The maximum expression of prejudice is seen in the 70s, in 1975, Zionism, racism, where in extreme cases such as those of in Latin America, Mexico especially, there is a similar difference in Brazil. So we see accusations leveled against the state of Israel, Zionism, and Jews. And we see how those overlap and interact. We're talking about movements and processes that I will try to explain later. But there is an overlap, and they feed each other and reinforce each other in terms of meaning and what we connect them to. If, some see Zionism as expansionist and colonialist, as ethnic cleansing. We are hearing about aggressive Zionism, and this begins to be connected with linked to Jews as money lovers, as arrogant, as wanting to dominate the world, or in the case of Israel, what we see is the turning of the victim into a victimizer. And we see that after the Six-Day War. We also hear accusations of genocide, and also there is a challenge to the memory of the Holocaust as being manipulated. And this leads to displacement, crimes of war, a terrorist state, Western capitalism as an appendix of Western domination, as an outpost of Western domination. And what I must mention is the difference between war crimes and genocide, which is a fundamental difference that cannot be overlooked. And also the concept of colonialism and what we call settler colonialism. This accusation speaks of a wish by Israel to annihilate the local population, the native local population, meaning the Palestinian population. What I said earlier is that I do believe that historically there have been overlaps in the construction of these processes, but they merge together more and more. I would say that the motives are multiple. Criticism of Israel is legitimate. Criticism level at Israel's behavior is legitimate. What is not legitimate, however, when these means and tools include images which are deeply rooted in anti-Semitism, conspiracy theories, talking of a vocation for extermination, and the evoking of extermination. This is a summary, but there's so many factors at play, what the cultural legacies are, the characteristics of the population, and of course, something that must be said here, and here I'll take a leap to today, which is what we I believe, should try to understand. The possible outcomes of this type of challenging that happens at different levels is that we see normalization of hostility against Israel and against the Jewish people as well. Discourse is becoming radicalized. The thresholds for rejection and acceptance have been reset. There is more acceptance of rejection and delegitimization of Israel. And this is expressed as violence, both symbolical and physical. And this is one of the problems that we are witnessing currently. What are the limits and what is the inner debate between researchers, organized Jewish communities, and the state of Israel about the limits, the boundaries, and differences between anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism, and criticism of Israel? So this is what I see as fundamentally important. This criticism may have legal dimensions and legitimate dimensions, by the way, and also deeply prejudiced and dimensions that express deep rejection. So, if I may, and speak briefly of this because we will be able to delve deeper into this throughout this series. 1968 was a watershed moment in terms for academia, and the campus, university campus, was the time for this highly idealized revolution and the time for youth and change, and also the appearance of what was named the New Left, which questioned and criticized this national solution, this Jewish nationalism, because Israel is seen as a Western model nationalism and not as the nationalism of an oppressed people. What we see is that today, with this leap forward, what we see is that academia and campuses are a venue where new knowledge is developed to try and understand better certain expressions that are not just or only European, but rather also brings back prejudice, different types of prejudice. One of them is that in the face of the global North, the global South is a venue for liberation from the West. And this is what we've seen as fundamental expressions of the way we view October 7th, which is seen as a time of revolutionary change and liberation. Jews and Israel are not seen as being part of the global South, but rather as part of a center. So the concept is that Jews are white or whitened. They're not seen as an ethnic minority. They don't have a history of persecution, supposedly, and anti-Semitism is not seen as yet another expression of hate. There is this idea of rich, Western, capitalist, imperialist Jews. And so Constantine is the Jew who reaches an agreement with the empire, and Israel is seen as complicit with the West. So, if I may, I'd like to say that many authors that we work with or that we have consulted, we've seen in their writings that how the Middle East conflict is a consequence of the acts of Israel only and as potentially disruptive. And this leads us to campuses as a venue. And this can help us understand, and I will try to speed up, how within a context of a global world of globalization, of ideas, images, organizations, and movements, the main fundamental questioning of Zionism that borders on anti-Semitism in certain ways is what, and now I'm speaking of Latin America, what we see is a cultural code that we would share. And we're talking about anti-colonialist, anti-racist, anti-capitalist, anti-imperialist positions. And this appears as a form of antagonism that does not allow people to see the projects for the construction of a regional position. So and that leads me to the Middle East. So these manifestations, both in terms of discourse and its manifestations today, that go from criticism of Zionism, which seems more useful to replace with criticism for the state of the state of Israel or Jewish history, is what we see emerging in Latin America. And in Latin America, it appears in a clear division. If we look at this table, we'll see who has expressed support for Ukraine, and I'm trying to draw a link between the conflicts, or those who have sided with Russia, and how this relates to their support for Israel or Hamas. So Mexico and Brazil are examples of equidistant positions. But these have not evolved in a simple or easy manner, especially in campuses and in the university in the university atmosphere. Luis Schoniger is here, I think. He's a dear colleague, and he has made an attempt, quite interestingly, to see how, as part of this pink tide, that of progressive governments and populist regimes, we have seen an extension of positions which have been very much critical with anti-Semitic undertones. And we believe that there is a paradigmatic case in Venezuela. And this is an example of how countries in Latin America have not been able to consolidate strong regional alliances. However, prejudice and organization have transcended borders through entities and movements. On October 8th, one day after October 7th, the Federation of Argentinian Palestinian entities spoke about what happened after the October 7th massacre and characterize it as an uprising of our brothers that are exercising their legitimate defense against the siege laid by the state of Israel and on the largest open sky prison in the world. And they pointed their fingers at the occupation, at the occupying power, and talking about the arrogance of the occupier, and also issues a call to applaud this act of liberation. We also see how in October, several groupings emerge in Peru, in Greece, in Italy, in Brazil, in Azerbaijan, and across Latin America, where once again we see Hamas being described as an organization for Palestinian resistance. Hamas appears there as a reference and appears as being embodying the whole drama of the Palestinian people, and that creates very serious confusions in these popular protests. But this is not akin to what happened after the Six-Day War, or even the establishment of the Jewish state, but even before that. And we're talking about the project that of the 20th century through land grabbing from the Palestinian people by through the creation of Israel as a colonizing entity that has been has been a result of U.S. colonialism. And it's very interesting and unfortunate to see an ahistorical reading of when and how empires fall apart and who and what the Jews are in those empires. And of course, towards the end of the 20th century generates different situations. So what we see in Latin America, that both the streets and the campus are venues for expression, as are social networks, social media. And these are some posters. Very interesting to see that the posters, excuse me, somebody's microphone on. Apparently somebody has their microphone on. So these posters, what we see is the production, the art production, the printers is in Chile, are in Chile, Mexico, and the campus, their campuses, Chile, Argentina. But without a doubt, the defense of the Palestinian people focuses on the defense of Hamas, and the destruction of the state of Israel emerges as one of the purposes. Colombia is another case in point, genocide in Palestine, and a call for solidarity. I would like to wrap up this part of my presentation with these pictures by saying that there is a flow throughout the region and also towards the north. And if we go back, we'll see that many of the expressions that we see here are also seen in the United States, in campuses, and throughout Europe with their unique expressions. I'm going back, but this creates a very difficult situation. So where is the limit between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism? If you go to a university and you see a poster that reads Zionists out of this university. And who are Zionists? Well, Jews. Well, they say not all Jews. There are some good Jews and bad Jews. That's true. But here I'm saying this ironically, aside from this distinction, there are some critical voices within the Jewish intellectual world that we need to set apart as well and try to understand what the links are to other types of expressions so that we do not take this lightly. And there's a third pillar, the streets, as I said, the protests, campuses, and social media. and they provide anonymity, immediacy, and a global nature to what is posted. And social media have a central role in anti-Semitic expressions on the internet. There is a collective identity, a sense of community, a global racial subculture connected to specific centers of explicit organization and nodes of explicit organization. So I did not dwell on the specific changes that have taken place, but in Latin America, we'll see that when you analyze expressions on the internet, Mexico and Colombia have 17% in Mexico and Colombia of the total content about the conflict on Twitter, 17% contained anti-Semitic expressions and comments. I am going to wrap up. I do not want to abuse the time that we have. I've gone over time already, and I'd like to have some time for questions and answers. But let me just say that we are at a time when we see continuity and change, continuity and rupture of breaking up of historical expressions of anti-Semitism. Its format, and its expressions are different. From the beginning, I said that I would not like to oversimplify and lead people to think that Latin America is a fertile ground or is the territory of anti-Semitism. We've said that it's difficult for certain cultures where there is intolerance to diversity, and it's hard to deal with a group with a different aspiration to this homogeneous people and culture. What we see is convergence in different positions, the right, the left, and this new effervescent new left that we see today, where Hamas is seen as synonymous to the Palestinian people and legitimate criticism to the policies implemented by the State of Israel is intermingled with prejudice. We've talked about how Jews, Zionism, and Israel are all attacked. And that's where the expression of Judeophobia emerges as an intellectual Judeophobic capital or social capital that has led to several expressions, such as for Jews community is too important, their religion, their nationalism, their cosmopolitan beings, and all of this has been transferred from the state to Jewish communities. And as I've also tried to say, there is a challenge to the existence proper of the state of Israel, to there being political sovereignty, the reversion of and turning the victim into a victimizer, and the cancellation of the memory of the Holocaust expressed by such important voices to understand Latin America from the point of view and the concept of the global South that see and view the state of Israel as the perpetrator of a new Holocaust. So after this, and knowing that I went over time, and I apologize for that, I would like to now open the floor, and please feel free and comfortable to interact over the next few minutes that we have. If I'm not mistaken, we still have a few minutes to raise your hand and ask questions. I mean, we don't have time for very many questions, but if you send them in writing to me, I will get back to you in writing as well throughout this series with an answer. So I'm here at your service and ready to entertain questions. I think there are 3 minutes left. Thank you, Tony. Luis? my dear Luis. We can't hear you. We can't hear you, Luis. You're on mute. Thank you very much, Judith, for your great overview. What I would like to hear from you, if you have time throughout the series, maybe, to elucidate, excuse me, something that is right surprising, which is the coming together of the new left and radical Islam. And all of this around the politicization of the human rights discourse. And that it was great, creates great uncertainty between those of us who are human rights supporters and amongst us vis-a-vis the policy on human rights. I find your comment of the utmost importance, and I believe that we can and we must broach that throughout the series. I would like to invite you to join us throughout it, and you have been one of our speakers, and you might become yet another one. So I think that this distinction that you draw is very important, what the new left is that we're talking about, and to what extent the progressive movement does not reside in the left, and radical Islam, which does not represent all of the Arab culture or the Arab world. Once this issue becomes politicized, it becomes very hard for us to find ourselves as in the defense of human rights in a space that vindicates the existence of the state of Israel or the memory of the Holocaust or the Jewish condition as something that would prevent that universalism from taking root, right? Yes, I take you up and I'll take up that challenge and we'll do it. And I'd like to invite you to be part of it. Yes, of course, I feel it's important. Thank you, Luis. Thank you so much. Thank you. Yes, go ahead, please. I think there are two hands raised. One, I see a hand from the University of Political Science, Carlos Ballesteros and Ariel Dulitsky. Please be brief. Thank you. Carlos, please. You have the floor. You're on mute, Carlos. Right, my microphone was on mute. But first of all, I'd like to thank you for your excellent presentation, Dr. Bokser. I believe that this is a very important issue, and I think we should hear from you, Judith, about how to counter this wave of anti-Semitism that we're currently witnessing around the globe. It might be there is legitimate criticism, as you said, to the actions of the state of Israel. I think that that's also very important for us to talk about. Yes, I believe I understand your point, and we work for the same school and university, and we know how difficult this task is to draw distinction between those two concepts. I'll say something, and then I will give the floor to Ariel before we close. My dear Carlos, I have so often waited to hear from our colleagues about what's happened in Syria historically and what is currently happening. And the issue of human rights is completely stifled there and then once again goes back to Israel so strongly. But I think we have the opportunity and even the commitment. You are a distinguished professor at the university, and we've never had a chance to talk to each other about this. I think it would be a good idea for us to elaborate on the distinction between legitimate criticism and the criticism that undermines the existence of the state itself. So finally, Ariel, I don't know you. Thank you. Thank you, Judith. I am a professor at the University of Texas, a human rights lawyer and professor at the University of Texas. So your presentation helps me understand how important it is to avoid oversimplification and try to delve deeper into the distinction between legitimate criticism of the policies carried out by Israel and anti-Semitism. And I was very enthusiastic, but at the end, I was a bit let down by the posters that I saw from universities in Venezuela, if I'm not mistaken, Uruguay and Guatemala. And I don't see them as anti-Semitic at all. I mean, what they were referring to was to stopping the genocide, but there was no reference in those posters to being against Judaism or Zionism as an expression of the liberation of the Jewish people. Could you please elaborate on these specific posters so that we understand when we are faced with legitimate criticism vis-a-vis an anti-Semitic attitude? I don't have the time now, but I would be interested in talking about more about this throughout the series. But you, as a lawyer, and we're all concerned with human rights, let me say that there is a difference between an accusation of war crimes and genocide. And I think that that difference did not really happen in the case of Israel. So we will be able to talk about it again later. I'd like for us to bring up those elements that will make it easier for us to see it. So this whole dimension of having a extermination as a purpose did not exist. And I am aware of the fact that in Israel this week, a group of researchers working with Manlead published a document which analyzes the war. And I believe you're familiar with that. And the concept of ethnic cleansing came up, which I am fundamentally adjudicating to the and attributing to the polarization in academia, in the world, and in Israeli academia. But we're out of time, unfortunately, and I will undertake to, throughout the series, to broach this with the other colleagues who will be joining us. And maybe the poster is not the best example. So what I was talking about was campuses and the streets. But we'll be able to talk about it later. I do not want you to feel let down or deceived. But the dialogue has broken down. We're an academia that has been divided, a people that has been divided, and humanity is divided in many ways. So I believe this should be my answer. There is a difference. There is a fundamental difference. And together with my colleagues, I will try to expand on that, and we'll debate that. And if this series is interactive indeed, then several of us here today can continue to speak and interact in this venue. So this is the end of my presentation. El Shaddai?
Yeah, yeah. Yep. Thank you all. Yep. Thank you all for joining us, and we'll see you for the next session.